Here's the thing I think about big data. Medicine, really at its roots, is hardly implementing any sort of smart strategies that acknowledge the individual differences of patients, customize treatments, understand the comparative effectiveness of the options that people have placed in front of them. The clinical research enterprise, as it currently exists, is wholly inadequate to keep up with the information needs of patients and doctors and policymakers and administrators and managers. And in part, we're waste the most valued resource in the healthcare system every day, which is the actual experience that patients have with their doctors. So one way of conceptualizing it is, it's as if we're doing what we call N-of-1 trials. There's an experience between a patient and a doctor, something happens, the decisions are made, outcomes accrue, and we throw them away. So we run all these experiments every day, in essence, but we don't learn anything from them. We are extraordinarily inefficient in trying to harvest that.
It's sort of worth thinking for a second about the size of the data that's available. I was sort of blown away thinking about this earlier today. There's 150 exabytes. Anyone know what an exabyte is? I had to Google it. So 150 exabytes of healthcare data in the US. So 5 exabytes would easily, so it's 10 to the 18th gigabytes, so it would easily contain all of the words ever spoken by people in the history of time. Okay, and we have about, 30 times that in healthcare data in the US alone. So Kaiser itself is estimated to have somewhere between 26 and 45 petabytes, okay, which in and of itself is about 4,500 times the amount of data held by the national, by the Libraries of Congress. I think the core 4 challenges that we face are questions that can be answered with big data. And I think the first is, how do we predict risk? Okay, so how do we identify who is going to get sick and intervene earlier? I think the second is doing a much better job understanding what quality looks like. Okay, so it's sort of ironic that via TripAdvisor, I knew more about the hotel that I stayed in last week in Los Angeles than about the quality of medical care that's being offered in most hospitals. And so I think big data can inform that. I think the third is matching. And it's matching patients with their providers, so we know where to go to get the best outcomes. And I think second, it's matching patients with the best treatments. So it's rather than getting the average treatment effect, it's getting the treatment for that individual. And then I think the fourth is sort of this bookkeeping, which is slightly more where I'm interested. Where does the money flow? We spend $3 trillion a year in the US. Where is this money going around the system? Where is it bleeding out? What represents value and what doesn't? And I think big data can inform all 4 of those components.
Big data is not a size, it's like a state of mind. The question is whether you're just aggregating larger amounts of data or whether you're thinking about it in more complex ways. A lot of our methods are wholly reductionist. They force us to contort our research question to answer something very narrow. I mean, it's good to leverage things like Google and Twitter, but the question is, are we recognizing the complexity of the data? And to me, that's about the interaction. So it's much more akin to systems biology, where people talk about emergent phenomenon, that you can't just look at the components and understand what the output's going to be. You've got to be able to understand the way in which everything's reflecting on everything else. In biological systems, that's how it works. I mean, you can't just say, with few exceptions, you can't really just say, I can track this biological system to get to this output. It's a matter of how things are all interacting with themselves, and there's so many different feedback loops that you can't possibly understand them in a very simplistic manner. Yet, when we turn to clinical medicine, our articles are about trying to isolate an individual factor, holding all other factors constant, as if there's no interactions between any of the factors. And so, to me, the big data in the issue about leveraging machine learning and all of this is saying, we need help, because no person can keep all of this in their head. We need ample enough data, and then I think of it as sort of a mentored machine learning, which is, there should be iterative, there should be bi-directional work where there's some machine learning, but then there's some reflections. Does this make any sense? Because either one by themselves probably are inadequate to solve the problems that we need to do, the insights that we need to yield. So for me, this is about, it's a mindset shift.
This is where the big data is going to make a difference. That part of the reason you saw these average treatment effects was that you simply didn't have enough data to talk about what it meant for an individual patient with any degree of precision. And so I think the actual expansion of it allows you to more accurately say, what does this mean for Dan sitting there in the 3rd row? Because we now have the data and enough versions of, hi Dan, some variants of Dan that we can estimate that with with precision.
The way I think about big data is the different way in which you can ask questions when you have highly multidimensional data sets. What we mean is many variables that can have complex interactions to affect an outcome. Traditional clinical trials say, I'm going to test the effect of variable X on variable Y. And that's fine as far as it goes, but putting it all together to see what are all the things that affect it. A good example of this is David Madigan, the statistics professor at Columbia, ran a project called OMOP, which is about interactions and adverse effects in drugs. What combinations of drugs come up with harmful side effects? They found new side effects that had not been reported or were not known from combinations of drugs. They also found that when you simulate the conditions and tests of clinical experiments, when you have all the data, when you can cheat and find out what the real answer is, and you have all the dimensions, you find that they actually come up with erroneous solutions a lot of the time. 5% p-values give you the right answer at only about half the time. You'd think it would be 1 in 20. That's not actually what a p-value means, but they're wrong half the time. Studies show that. Usually studies, in fact, don't show that unless you carefully look at them to make sure that they were properly conducted and had sounder statistical methodology. So I think big data, if you have all the information about many individuals, you are able to ask questions that build models about the interactions between variables all at once.
I sound like a little bit of a curmudgeon here, but I think the practical realities actually have been touched on. One is just the operational impact of this on day-to-day workflow, which I think, as everybody knows, physicians are certainly being driven harder and harder every day, despite maybe the moral hazard or some of the reimbursement issues that people refer to. The reality of it is the day is very busy, and anything that influences the workflow, they're particularly not interested in, quite frankly. I think the other point that Harlan raised is a big one, which is the docs really aren't trained in this. I think you have to take a half a step back. At the end of the day, do you want your physician well trained in anatomy and physiology, or do you want him or her to know a little bit more about big data? So when you get into medical school curriculums and training curriculums, the reality of it is there's never any time for anything else. So it's pure medicine all the time. I'm not saying that's necessarily right or wrong, but that's the practical reality. And by the way, when you do your board exams and all that, that's the only questions that they ask you are about endocarditis. They don't ask you about p-values and all that. So the reality of it is, when you go see your doc, that's what you still want today. So we can't miss that the core transaction in healthcare is still between a doctor and a patient. So I'm not negative on big data. It's just there's a long way to go to get to the bedside.